Hello and welcome wherever you may be to our complimentary webinar, which is brought to you in partnership with Jabra, Auscontact's national silver sponsor, and it's entitled The Autonomous Customer 2020, Trends to Transform Your Digital Customer Experience. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and during this time, with the help of today's special guest, Dr. Nicola Millard, Principal Innovation Partner at BT, we hope to spark your interest, engage you in the conversation, and provide some ideas to take back to your organisation. And to round off the session, there'll be a Q&A. I'm Fiona Keogh, CEO of Auscontact, and your moderator for today. While we're waiting for everyone to join us, let's take the time to do some housekeeping. Remember to interact with us today to get the best benefit out of the session. And as you know, there's no need to take too many notes, as we'll be providing you with the recording of the webinar. To interact with us, please use the Q&A button on the control panel. You can ask questions or make comments for Nicola or myself from time to time. And remember, we are going to have that full Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please type your questions as we go along so you don't forget to ask them. If you're listening through headphones or speakers and experience any issues with your internet connection, please note that on the control panel, you can click the raise hand button and the Auscontact team will rush to your aid, or you can revert to your confirmation email and the link that has the link to the webinar, and it also contains all the relevant phone numbers and access codes. I know that many of you are familiar with asking questions, but let's try out the Q&A button on the control panel now. And the question for today is, has the bushfire season in Australia already started? Now, some of us think it's a little bit too early for that, and some of us are thinking other things. There's a place on the New South Wales, Renato knows the answer. Kieran's not sure, that's okay. Yes, TW knows the answer. Okay, so we've got a few people. So the answer is actually yes. Yeah, John, I agree. I wish it was hope not, but it's officially been declared. There is a fire on the New South Wales-Queensland border, and it's not at the border crossing where you get stopped without a permit. It's at a place called Duranbar. And we are already starting, and we're starting extra early. So you clearly know how to use the Q&A pane. So let me introduce one of our hosts for today, and that is David Piggott. And David is the Managing Director of Jabra for ANZ, and for many of you, an extremely familiar face. He's been the Managing Director for nearly 6 years, and during that time, the business has grown almost 600%. Your targets are going to be absolute rip snorters, David, in the next 12 months. This fantastic success can be attributed to the current growth market and his amazing team of 23 that serves the contact centre industry in Australia and New Zealand. With over 25 years experience working in the IT industry with companies such as Cisco, Avaya and Telstra, David is focused on profitable growth through building sales excellence, channel loyalty, and an absolute focus on end user customer satisfaction. When David's not busy at work or with his family, he's usually found cycling or sailing around Pittwater. Welcome, David, and over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. As you see from the change in the beard, this is grown the COVID beard since that photo was taken. Now, I have the great job of introducing Dr. Nicola Millard, PhD. The title of the presentation, as Fiona has said, is The Autonomous Customer of 2020, Global Trends Shaping the Future of the Contact Centre. Now, it's the 10th anniversary of BT's research on customer attitudes around the world, and the 2020 edition shows how channel preferences are shifting, what customers are looking for in customer experiences, and whether they think technologies like artificial intelligence might help or, in fact, hinder. The key takeaways that Nicola will go through today are insights on customer expectations of the digital customer experience and the contact center. A reality check on the channel mix and technologies that customers are looking for, and some examples of the impact that COVID-19 is having on these trends. Now to Nicola. She has once described as human caffeine on Twitter. Dr. Nicola Millard injects a positive, people-centered espresso shot of innovation and future strategy. Half social scientist and half technologist, but all academic. She uses data to shape provocations and stories to engage and create conversations from the boardroom all the way to the front line. No frothy coffee, just solid research. Nicola has done a number of jobs during her long and varied career with BT, including futurology, research, usability, customer service, marketing, and business consulting. She was involved in a number of BT firsts, including the first application of artificial intelligence into BT's call centers and BT's initial experiments with home working. Nicola currently leads on customer innovation and digital workplace. And in 2019, she was listed as one of the top 10 UK customer experience influencers by Customer Experience magazine. Nicola got her PhD from Lancaster University in the UK in 2005 and published her first book in 2009. She is an award-winning presenter with 2 TED Talks and hundreds of conference appearances under her belt. She occasionally pops up on radio and TV around the world, including appearances on Woman's Hour and Tech Tent, The Genius of Invention, and Back in Time for the Weekend for the BBC. I give you Dr. Nicola Millard.
Wow, gosh, I feel quite exhausted after all that. So hello, everybody. My name is Nicola. I did used to be a futurologist, but I think even futurologists would admit that although pandemics were always on that sort of long-term things that might disrupt things list, we didn't quite realize that we were going to be as disrupted as we are. So I'm actually broadcasting live from my kitchen in Ipswich in the UK. So it's very early morning for me, and I must confess I think I need some caffeine, and not just human caffeine. I have not had coffee this morning, so we're going to see how this presentation goes through, because normally I've had about 3 before I start to talk. So yeah, I'm actually part of BT. For those of you who are not familiar with BT, BT or British Telecommunications, we're the biggest broadband and mobile network provider in the UK. I'm actually part of our corporate division. So my role is to innovate with and for our large global corporates and UK corporates. I have spent quite a lot of time in Australia in my past. We actually have offices. We've got one in Sydney, we've got one in Melbourne, and we've got one in Perth. So I've done all 3 of those offices and done a lot of work with a number of Australian companies in the past. I wish I could be with you actually, because I love Australia, but it is actually my commute today only really involved having a shower and coming downstairs rather than spending 24 hours on a plane. So there are some positives here, but just as a bit of background as to the kind of thing I do, because it is a bit weird, I am part of BT's innovation team. Now, BT is, obviously, we're regarded as a very sort of old, staid, uninnovative company, but that's far from the truth. We're actually the 3rd biggest investor for a start in research and innovation in the UK. We filed the most patents, I think, into Europe of any large corporate. We've actually got more patents, I think, largely in the AI space in the past year than any corporate in the UK. So we do a lot of innovation. What we are very bad at doing is downstreaming it. So the team I am in is really there to work with and for our large global corporates and our large UK corporates to help them access a lot of the stuff that we do in BT. And the reason I'm in Ipswich, which is in the east of England, is that our main research and development centre is about 7 miles down the road from me, and that's where normally I would be based, and surrounded by about 4,000 people on site there, most of whom are technologists, and you would expect that from a telecoms and IT company. But I myself, I'm only half a technologist. I am actually a psychologist by background, so my role really is to understand the human element in innovation, because as I keep saying, the most disruptive part of innovation isn't the technology, it is of course us, because unless we use it and embrace it, you know, it doesn't work terribly well. So that's why I'm in the innovation team. That's the first thing. What I'm going to talk to you about today is one of the pivotal things that we do, or at least I do, to help inform my job, which is to try and understand the biggest disruptor, which is customers, and understand how those customer behaviors are changing and evolving. And the lovely thing about the work that I do is that we've been doing it for quite a long time. The research I'm going to talk about is called the autonomous customer. And the autonomous customer has been around in various forms for the past 10 years. It's our 10th anniversary of doing the research. We started quite modestly back in 2010 with 2 countries, 500 customers per country. And like any good piece of research, what we try and do is to get a representative demographic split, gender split, all of those lovely things to try and represent the population. But as you will see, as we got kind of more and more ambitious as the years went on, you will see Australia does pop up a few times, and I'm very happy to say that this research did include Australia this year. So we actually completed the research in November 2019, and we published it just before the pandemic hit back in February. So what I'm going to do is to talk you through the trends. But obviously it's been a busy time for everybody over the past few months with pandemics and things. So what I'm going to do is reflect a little bit on how I think some of those trends have changed during the pandemic, or have they, is the very big question. So what I'm going to do is talk you through some of the trends, do a little bit of a deep dive on a few of them. And we've got a Q&A session at the end. So if you do have any questions, I will try and answer them. Okay. So let's go across the umbrella trends. So I think there's good news and there's bad news. This is the global data, by the way. It's the global average that I'm showing you here. What we're finding, firstly, unsurprisingly, frankly, because most of us have been talking about this for a long time, is that customer expectations of service are still going up. And if you ask me about what's happened during the pandemic, it hasn't gone down. In fact, I think the evidence is there that the expectations are going up. So although customers understand that we are having to cope with a lot of things as corporates in terms of, you know, disruption due to the pandemic, it's not causing them to reduce their expectations of customer service at all. I think here in the UK, we saw quite a lot of evidence very early on in the pandemic, for example, that if the supermarket couldn't deliver the groceries when you wanted it and the groceries you wanted, despite the fact there's a global pandemic going on, they switched, and they switched to often very local suppliers as well. So we can see there's no loyalty in the market for a start, and customer service is driving a lot of that stuff. Now, for those of you who may have seen me speak before, you will also know that we've been looking at some of the drivers of those service expectations. And the one that keeps coming out, you know, time and time again, is this notion of customer effort, or as we prefer to describe it, easy. So not a surprise. I mean, we all want an easy life. I think none of us would say that, make my life more difficult, please. So we have complicated lives anyway. And what we find is that there is an enormous amount of this loyalty being driven by easy. So again, you know, 3 in 4 customers are saying, I will buy more from you. If you just make it easy for me to do it, I will do it. And there's lots of linkages that we found since, you know, I think it was probably about 3 or 4 iterations ago that this started to emerge as a theme. In terms of how we've started to innovate around this, actually it's quite, you know, common now for people to measure things like customer effort scores. We started off really early on, and actually we did work with the customer effort guys, and we did try customer effort. It just didn't quite work for us. So at the time, which was probably about 9 years ago, we said we need a measure to really focus our attention down on this easy thing, because we know it's really important to customers. So we frankly ripped off the Net Promoter Score and we turned it into the Net Easy score. And we've been measuring easy ever since, certainly within our consumer division, which is the guys that look after the UK business. They've been asking the question, how easy have you found it dealing with BT today? And you mark us easy, difficult, don't know. Get +1 for easy, -1 for difficult, nothing for don't know. You add it up, you come out positive or negative. And then of course the question is why? Because we need to also find out what customers are finding easy, what they're finding difficult, eliminate the friction. What we found is not rocket science. So firstly, our main score is Net Promoter. I think pretty much everyone is using Net Promoter now. it drives Net Promoter Score because people are very unlikely to recommend if they found things difficult. So that's the first thing. We also know that customers who are finding things difficult are 40% more likely to churn. So we see a very, very distinct linkage into loyalty. But for the contact center, it's actually been a lovely measure because Net Promoter can be a great strategic score, but sometimes you can't see the contact center in it. And sometimes it's very difficult to measure a very small part of the customer journey. With the Net Easy score, we can start to identify, did that piece of training work? Is the website misleading? Is there a bit of information that's completely confusing the customer? And obviously we can start to change that. And I must confess, the first thing we found out was our IVR was a nightmare. Now, quite a lot of them are, because they don't really evolve, they mutate, don't they? So I think we got to about press 53 at one point, and that's not easy for customers. So we did a lot of natural language stuff. We simplified the menus when they did need to go down to the DTMFs, the press 1, press 2. And we used the customer language. And as a result, our Net Easy scores significantly improved. So I think easy is a lovely measure for the contact center. So all of that's the good news. I guess the bad news, and really magnified by the pandemic, is the digital experience sitting alongside, or well, it's kind of forming the customer decision, and it's the front end often for customers to come and interact with organizations. And sadly, what we're finding is that the expectation of the digital experience is also incredibly high, but delivery is not so good. So only 21% of these global customers are rating the experience as excellent. So there's room for a lot of maneuver here, that we can get better in terms of delivering digital experiences. And the one thing that the pandemic has done is accelerate digital. So I was working with one of our clients last week on their digital experience, and they were saying this has pushed their digital experience forward by at least 3 years. They're doing things that they weren't planning to do because they're trying to push people to digital. And of course, when all of us were frantically trying to move our contact centers from, office-based to home-based, quite a lot of organizations had to push people towards digital because they'd often switch their phones off, at least temporarily. More on that in a minute. But the digital experience, I think, is becoming more important. And frankly, we've got to get a lot better at it, because there are ripple effects that we see in this research because of that 21% not actually rating the digital experience as good. So this is a graph. I get unreasonably excited about graphs. I'm sorry, I am quite sad. But this graph, I think, is fascinating. This is UK data. Sadly, we don't have enough Australian data to do a 5-year comparison or a 5-iteration comparison of the research, but we do have UK data. So what you can see in the UK actually is, this is about channel choice. And this is about, if you have an issue, if you have a problem, what channel do you turn to? And it's quite interesting because all of the traditional channels, up until this iteration of the research, were kind of in a stately decline, I guess you could describe it. So the phone, email, face-to-face, all of those things were going down. And so we expected that to continue, to be honest, in our new research, and it didn't. And I often get asked, what did I find most surprising about the research? This, frankly, so the phone going down and then suddenly the phone having this massive spike. And I think this is being explained by the fact that digital experiences are not necessarily working for customers. So where do they go when things don't work? Well, they pick the phone up. So we are seeing that phone has been growing, not dying, which is really funny because a lot of conference talks I've been to have said, the phone is dead. It's not. More on that in a second. Email's got a slight spike. It's not going up quite as much as the phone. In fact, the only one that's doing a sort of the really kind of deep dive is things like post. Letter writing is maybe not the fashionable thing to do amongst most demographics now. We've also got the only one doing a significant sort of stately rise are apps. And again, when we look at regional variations, apps tend to be driven by the adoption of smartphones, and therefore, you'll see spikes in countries that have more smartphone adoption. You will also see that social media, which was much hyped in 2015, is not growing. In fact, that's going down as well. There are some issues around social media, which I'll talk about in more depth in a minute, but it's a very public channel. I also call it a channel shift channel because it's a very brave organization that does absolutely everything in public. So what we typically find with social media is if you pick a customer up, typically you'll then have to say, okay, well, we'll need to shift you to a one-to-one channel, and whether that's chat, whether that's email, you know, whether that's the phone, that's up to you, but it's a channel shift channel. The one that was the big grower in 2017, which was chat, is also going down. Now, we had a massive spike on chat in the 2017 research. It was relatively new at that point. A lot of people have deployed it. But again, that digital experience hasn't necessarily been there. And as a result, that's been going down as well. More on that in a second. So let's take a look at the first big surprise trend, which is really around the phone. As I said, a lot of people were predicting that nobody would be phoning organizations in 2020. That's so old fashioned. Yeah, well, they are. Also, I've heard a lot of people, particularly again at conferences, going, well, millennials never use the phone. This, again, surprising data. When we unpicked it, we found out that the biggest individuals to actually pick up the phone were the millennials. In fact, they beat the over 65s in terms of their propensity to ring. Now, we've been doing some research on this because that's always my thing around data. It's kind of, well, firstly, is it right? And secondly, why? And I think what we're seeing with millennials especially is that they are very digitally savvy. They are digital first. They go to the digital channels. They try and do what they need to do. They're very impatient. It's not easy. They get frustrated. And the first thing they do is pick the phone up. So, we're seeing that driven from digital to the phone. On the over 65s, that's not the case so much. Mostly they regard the phone as the primary channel. That's the first place they go. And we're also seeing, and we've seen this over the years, and all of you know this anyway, but, the complexity and emotiveness that comes through the phone channel is increasing as well. We have seen over the years average call handle time start to go up rather than down. And some people panicked about that. And I keep saying, no, actually, that's probably what you want, because you're only getting the complex stuff through. Now, if only that was the case, if we get digital right, I suspect we'll start to, in the contact center, absolutely maybe get less calls, but get longer, more complex and emotive stuff. But the phone is good at complex and emotive, and there is a knock-on effect to the agents. Some people have said that they think the stats on the right-hand side of the screen are quite negative stats around agents putting me on hold, agents not knowing what's on their website, agents not knowing their product set. That's more a consequence of the fact that agents have a more complicated job to do, and we can't train them every day. They have a day job. They've got to talk to customers. We can't update their brains enough. So the counter argument on that one is, how do we give them better knowledge tools? How do we give them better access to information? Absolutely. How do we use maybe AI to upskill them as well, so that even if they don't know stuff, we can actually take them through a step-by-step process. So we're working with a number of organizations, one called Walk Me at the moment, around how can we have something that just sits next to the agent on their screen, and if they're not familiar with something, if they can't use the system, it just provides a little bit of, this is how you do stuff. Particularly important when you can't do sit-bys at the moment because they're not actually physically in the contact center. So how do we help and handhold them? So that's the phone. Obviously, messaging was the big trend in the previous iteration of the research, and it's quite curious that it's not going to go away. And I think generally the pointers on messaging are very positive. So customers find it easy. It's a digital first channel. It kind of puts them in control. What we're starting to see is this interesting split, I guess, between asynchronous messaging and synchronous messaging. So synchronous messaging, previously, we're talking about things like web chats here. So in other words, it's like a real-time conversation with the agent. The agent is online at the same time as the customer. They're trying to have a conversation. Now, that experience isn't necessarily working terribly well. I moved house. I've been in this house for about a year now, scarily. And when I moved house, I did a lot of chat sessions, and I must confess the experience was not good. because I knew the agents were on multiple sessions. So there was a lot of, stuttering conversation because I knew the agents were doing something else. They were having a conversation with another customer. How dare they? So it was slow. And actually, sometimes it just dropped out. Sometimes I ended up going, can I just ring you? It's much, much easier. So again, the challenge then is if you want to switch channels, does your messaging agent actually have access to a phone? So there's some frustrations, I think, that are driving the people away from synchronous messaging. But we're seeing growth in asynchronous messaging. So I'm talking about things like WhatsApp, for example. We've done a lot of WhatsApp implementations over the past year. Firstly, because customers are using it, so it's a good platform to use. But also, it is asynchronous. You don't actually have to have an agent right there having a conversation. Now, there are scheduling challenges into the contact center in terms of asynchronous, because it's far easier to schedule synchronous than it is asynchronous, because we've done synchronous for years. So aside from the scheduling headache, asynchronous does seem to be the way to go for customers. So think about your messaging. It still is very powerful. But as soon as you start to get into chat, you end up having a conversation. I have many of these conversations, by the way, about chat bots. Given that I'm in an innovation team, AI is always a theme that gets picked up. Now, chatbots, firstly, generally are not real AI. They have AI elements in them, things like natural language recognition, but they've obviously been part of the AI hype, and they're one of the most visible parts of AI hype. Firstly, the hype fueled that expectation from customers, and 73% of customers in 2017 were saying chatbots are going to really improve the customer experience. Then we encountered chatbots as customers, because a lot of chatbots have now been implemented, and I have to say 9 out of 10 of them are rubbish. They're awful. They end up dropping you into a dead end, or they don't answer your question, or it's just not a great digital experience. So again, we've got to question, firstly, yes, they can be used incredibly powerfully, but where should we use them? What's appropriate to use? Because a lot of this stuff around digital, yeah, it's exciting, but I think you get carried away in terms of the deployment of it. So we've learned a lot. I've worked on maybe about 20 chatbot projects, mostly with financial services clients, done a little bit with local government as well. And what we've learned is that I call it IVR for digital. So what you're doing is a digital triage. So rather than having your agents deal with simple stuff over chat, you don't want that, it tries to triage. So the first thing is triage is actually quite difficult. And of course, these things do not work by magic, they work by data. Where's that data coming from is usually the question I ask, because frankly, enterprise data can be really messy. It can be over different databases. Some of those databases are very stable, some of them are not. And that can be an absolute logistical nightmare in the background. So, where's the data? What's the quality of the data? Now, I have to say that the best chatbots use a very restricted amount of data. My personal favorite chatbot, by the way, because there are some I really love out there, was deployed by Lidl. I think it's still there, I need to check, but they had a chatbot called Margot. And Margot was a wine bot. So basically, Margot only does one thing, which is you tell it a food, it tells you what wine goes with that food. So it's a really deep and narrow set of data, which is brilliant for a chatbot. I hate wine. I apologise to everyone in Australia for not drinking Australian wine. I believe it's lovely, but I just don't drink wine. So I'm always making mistakes on wine. And when I go around to my winey friends who really, they're a bit of an aficionado. So, Margot has saved me on many occasions. Apparently the best thing to go with fish and chips, I've found out, is champagne. That just increased my fish and chip supper cost quite considerably. But of course, Lidl can then sell me champagne. So there are some really good bots out there, but they're quite limited. In terms of deployment, we did try one on complaints. Any of you who deal with complaints will know that probably wouldn't work for 2 reasons. Firstly, complaints are really long. So, and human language there's a lot of irrelevance in it. So you have to try and strip out the irrelevance. And that's actually really difficult, because all you want to say to the machine is this is the important bit. So that's difficult to actually pass all of that. The second thing is, and I know in Australia this is as bad as it is in the UK and Ireland, that when we complain, we often deploy the lowest form of wit. we use sarcasm, and algorithms do not get sarcasm. I've just got a few examples here. Thank you to a particular train operating company who I won't mention for my free sauna this morning. Now the bot thought that was a good comment. Why wouldn't it? It's never been on a train, it's never had a sauna, it doesn't understand that you stick the two together, and it's not very nice. So I would need to teach it that, and that's again some of the hidden costs of bots. There's a whole army of people labeling a lot of this stuff. So there's actually a company I found that's labeling sarcasm. That's a horrible job, but we've got to teach the machine. To be honest, the second one is very British. So it was so good to see your maintenance department hadn't spoilt things by making unnecessary repairs. I'm not sure how I would teach a bot that that's sarcasm. We know it's sarcasm, but a bot probably wouldn't. So there are things around context, especially that bots can't necessarily pick up, and emotion as well. Although, again, we've got some scary stuff going on around facial recognition algorithms that basically can pick up, are you smiling, are you frowning? And that can give some information to the algorithm, but that's also creepy. So I'm not sure I want that. The one thing we have learned is that you cannot abandon a customer at the bottom of a conversation when the bot doesn't understand, because that's a bad digital customer experience. So everything we've done with bots has really been around how do you integrate them with the contact center. You cannot have a standalone bot. So the first thing is, can you start to understand what the conversation was about? Once you've done that, can you start to skills-based route that to the agent with the right skills to actually deal with the conversation? And then critically porting the conversation across. So, you know, actually let the agent see what the customer said to the bot, so they can pick up the conversation, hopefully seamlessly, and that makes a better experience. So my advice after dealing with a lot of bots is make sure that you integrate it in with all of your skills-based routing and with your agent desktop. And of course, you know, there is a knock-on effect to the agents themselves. We did a paper called Botman versus Super Agent a couple of years ago, looking at some of the impact on agents of more and more automation, more and more AI. It doesn't make them redundant. It makes human skills much more important. And whether those skills, I mean, we just did some personas that you can see here. So Sally is picking up where the bot left off and trying to solve problems and understand what the problem is. Paula's a problem solver. So, you know, when computer says no, Paula's taking on that responsibility to solve the problem on behalf of the customer. Natalie's a negotiator, and negotiation is rules-based, but it's also, there's a lot of empathy and social skills required on it. So these are your high-level escalations people. So yeah, I think we're going to need a lot of Natalie's. And Tony's a techie. A lot of stuff is in his head, and it's very difficult to write stuff down that techies know. And I found this out because I did quite a lot of work in the very early days around complex fault diagnostics. And I interviewed a lot of our engineers around, well, how do you make a diagnosis? And, you know, you get a lovely neat tree and then you hit the bottom and you go, well, why did you decide it was that problem, not that problem? And they just go, I don't know, gut feeling. I can't put that into an algorithm. So, you know, that stuff is really valuable as well, experience. And I've included Chris, who's a crowdsourced advisor, because he's in the cloud. He might not work for you. He might be in the gig economy. He could be a customer, but he's got some specific skills that can help solve the problem. So, you know, that's a slightly different agent. And I keep saying we might need less of them, but we might need to pay them more, and they certainly are much more skilled. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the other trends that we found. Video was one that we predicted might actually rise. What it hasn't, even though, you know, this spike in the use of video during the pandemic has not necessarily fueled a spike in demand for customers to talk to businesses using video, with a couple of exceptions. One is healthcare. And the other one is things around remote diagnostics. We'd already seen a spike in the financial services industry around sort of expert advice. So whether that was mortgage advice or loans, we were seeing a lot of video being used there. But certainly we've seen some really exciting stuff. This is an example in the UK that we've been doing using 5G, using effectively an augmented reality headset with a paramedic in an ambulance. Not quite contact center, but, you know, this could be deployed using a more contact center situation. So the paramedic, he's got haptic gloves. He can broadcast real-time high definition video back to a remote medic with a VR headset on. So we can actually do a lot in the ambulance. Maybe we don't have to admit the person into hospital. So, you know, and there've been some pushback on this in the healthcare community up until the pandemic, because a lot of healthcare professionals were going, no, I need to be in the room with the patients. Now they don't want to be in the room with the patient. So we're seeing a massive spike on all sorts of things around remote diagnostics from a health perspective. The other one we found, one that we're using ourselves in BT, is remote engineer diagnostics. So this is something we deployed a couple of years ago. It's called Site Call, actually. And basically what it allows us to do is, with the customer's permission, if they're having a broadband problem, we send them a link, and that link enables us to get access to both the camera and the light on their smartphone. So what we can then say is, just show us what you've got plugged in. And because they're all standard wires as well, we've got AI using pattern recognition. We can actually auto-label the wires. We can auto-label the sockets that the wires need to go into, both for the agent's perspective, also from the customer's perspective. And that means we don't necessarily need to send an engineer out to customer premises quite as often. In fact, the evidence is not so much at all for basic broadband problems. And again, during the pandemic, we don't want to necessarily have to send engineers into a customer's home. So this has proved incredibly valuable. And to be honest, our Net Promoter Score and Net Easy scores are phenomenal on this from a customer perspective. From our perspective, it saves us a lot of money because engineer deployments are really expensive. So video is getting a niche. It's not a massive growth channel. Social media, I've already said quite a bit about, and I would say there's a distinction here in terms of, well, what industry are you in, as to the relative importance of paying attention to it and the volume that you get. So if you're a retailer or a travel company, you're probably going to really want to be on top of social media for service. If you're other companies, you might not need to. But I would say there's a distinction between service and sales. For sales, brand recognition, promotions, it works really well. For service, the expectation was really high about social media. So most of the customers we interviewed a couple of years back were saying, I expect a response within 15 minutes. Now, some people are very good at that, notably retailers and travel companies who are really on top of this. But a lot of us are not. And that doesn't mean that we should ignore it. It's just we need to manage customers' expectation and maybe point them towards a channel that they might get a better response. Although I would say most customers tend to use social media as a last resort. So they've tried the traditional channels, they failed, they go onto social media to try and embarrass you into action. But as I said, it's a channel shift channel. Typically customers have to be shifted off social media in order to solve the problem. And that means it can be costly. This one I'm not going to labour at all. It's one that's been in customers' minds for quite a long time. It's around security, and particularly security of data. And the fact that things like ID&V can be quite, it's not easy. I can't remember my 17,000 passwords. Now, we have been seeing sort of biometrics leaping into the space here, and that's largely because a lot of biometrics have gone down to my device. So whether it's voice biometrics or face biometrics, or, a bit of my body is my password. The good thing about biometrics from a customer perspective is it solves the easy versus secure problem. So it's secure and easy. And that's really what we're finding in this trust space around that horrible, horrible rigmarole of trying to identify that I am who I am. So we're starting to see quite a bit of growth in terms of biometrics for ID&V. The final trend I want to talk about, because I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions. The final trend I think is one of the most fascinating and exciting ones. And this one, we're starting on the journey, I guess. And I call this the me economy, because this is around customer data, and it's around how you use that data, and obviously how you use the algorithms to understand that data in order to create better customer experiences. And I always say that starts with personalization. And we know that personalization done well works nicely for customers, because Amazon have been doing it for years. Netflix have been doing it for years. It creates a better experience. It allows me to navigate choice better. But that's the first step. Once you've personalized, you can start to get a little bit more proactive. And this is around pushing demand out rather than having to manage demand inwards. And again, when done appropriately, if I can figure out what are customers likely to want to know, and we can see a few of the things there. So it's things like, there's some weird activity on my account. My subscription's coming to an end. My plane's been cancelled. All of those things are things I want to know. So we can push a message out. So that's the first thing. What do I want to know? Secondly, what's the channel I'm likely to be looking at? So again, how do we personalize the channel? I have to say that when we look at successive channels, SMS still is one of the most effective channels for customer attention. Certainly I'm working with a company called Contact Engine at the moment. They've said that 97% of people pick up an SMS within 3 minutes. So, but some people might not. So we need to target the right channel for the customer as well. And then timeliness, what time are they likely to want to know this? If we can get all that right, and it's telling customers things they want to know, they're probably going to share their data in order to actually let us tell them this. Hence, it's an economy. This is all about trading data for something back. So that's proactive. The next step is predictive, which is where the algorithms really do kick in. So can I tell customers things they want to know before they even know they want to know it? Now, we know that some of the supermarkets, the grocery stores are already getting a little bit creepy with our data, to be honest, because they know an awful lot about our shopping habits. So one of our UK retailers, actually a few years back, were telling me they know from a customer's behavior whether they're about to get divorced. Now, the problem then is, what do you do with that data? Do you send a proactive message to somebody going, I'm really sorry to hear you're getting divorced? Probably not, because they might not know, for a start. I keep saying it may be more subtle things like vouchers for wine, recommendations for lawyers. That might go down a little bit better. But the trouble with creepiness is that, again, customers are turned off by it. So if, again, I don't see the value in it, you know too much about me, I'm going to say, no, you can't have my data. And certainly, with things like the EU laws around GDPR, which I know are being echoed around the world now, customers have every right to withdraw their consent. But this is a fascinating trend from a technology perspective, because we're talking about smart cities, smart buildings, smart homes, Internet of Things at the moment. And those things are about me. And those things I can turn off if I don't think that there is any advantage of you knowing all about me, because you're not creating a better customer experience. So I think this is a really fascinating one around how do we sell to customers the benefits of giving their data to us? How do we create better customer experiences as a result? So those were all of the trends that we're finding. As that was a kind of a brief skim through. I don't know if any of you do have any questions. I'll be happy to try and answer any of the questions you have. So thank you very much for listening. Any questions?
Thanks, Nicola. And there is already a question, and I'm sure you'll know the answer to this one. TW would like to know, how much training was required to set up your AI to identify information on the screen?
Yeah, well, training's always a problem, isn't it? I mean, information on the screen, a lot of it relies on a very old technology called screen scraping. And my first AI project was back in 1990, and we were using screen scraping in 1990, and it was an utter pain in 1990, and it's still a pain. And it will depend what you're doing, but screen scraping is still one of the main things. So what you do is you say to the AI, I want you to pick up this bit of data on this particular part of the screen. The trouble is volatility of databases. In the 90s, the problem was the database guys would change the database and then not tell us. So we didn't repoint the AI to a different bit of the screen, and therefore then everything started to like a domino effect, fall over. And again, that was a hidden cost. And to be honest, that was the reason why the project failed in the 90s. As I said, it was complex fault diagnostics. So we were basically trying to train the AI to do a lot of the complexity using the data that we already had on various databases, so that we didn't need to employ agents that were engineers. We employed agents that were good at talking to customers who could have something that would help them diagnose faults. Didn't work. So again, it depends. That's why I keep saying, what data have you got? Where is that data? How stable is that data? And there are other methods other than screen scraping starting to develop, but the training costs are always, it varies. It's always one of those it depends questions, but the costs depend on how complex things are in the back end, largely.
Thank you. I suspected that might be the answer, but it's always good to hear from an expert that it is almost how long is a piece of string kind of thing ultimately. Let's come from the 1990s and into current day situation, Nicola. So from your perspective and what you're seeing, how have contact centres coped with the pandemic?
Well, it's been really interesting. I was actually in a contact centre in Ireland just as we knew there was probably going to be a lockdown happening, and there were a lot of very practical issues. Now, the first thing is, I think we're very fortunate. Had this pandemic happened 10 years ago, we wouldn't have had a large-scale deployment of cloud, for example. So, you know, that ability to be able to kind of just, you know, enable people to access things wherever they happen to be. That was the fortunate bit. I think with that particular customer, a lot of the struggle, and I'm sure a lot of you will relate to this if you've had to deploy a lot of agents from home, is that they often didn't have laptops, they didn't have the right technology. Again, one of our other customers said that they had really fortuitously just bought a whole ton of laptops before the pandemic, and they were able to easily deploy, but it wasn't so easy with some of our clients. And obviously during the first few weeks of the pandemic, there was a really big demand, not just for toilet roll, but for laptops. So they were quite difficult to get. And again, homeworking, that was one that my first homeworking experiment was in 1992 in BT. We actually tried it with contact center advisors, and it had always been a bit of a frustration to me that we hadn't seen hugely wide scale adoption. I know Australia were one of the leading adopters of some of the homeworking agent stuff, but I actually think, yeah, and it's kind of been borne out that agents have not actually had so much problem with the transition to working from home. I think it's been interesting interviewing some of the managers. They've been struggling a little bit more because a lot of the managers, when they're on the floor, are looking out for their teams, spotting when people are in trouble, obviously managing by walking around, doing a lot of sit downs and sit bys and coaching. And that's a lot more difficult when you're remote. So I think actually when we're looking at the agents versus the managers, a lot of the agents have adapted really well. Some of them have struggled because they don't necessarily have the right workspace. Some of them don't have their own home. They don't have a quiet space in their home. Some of them have a lot of kids running around in the background. That's difficult, particularly for an advisor, but actually they've not found it difficult in terms of managing their time or doing their job. It's the managers, I think, have had a much more difficult period of adjustment. But generally, I think things have gone on well. And I think a lot of the companies I've been talking to have been saying, well, we're now really considering more homeworking agents, largely because it does give you a slightly different population and pool of agents to pull from, sometimes a little bit older. As I said, you know, experience might well be a very relevant thing in agents of the future. And maybe coming from slightly different professions as well. Certainly in our past sort of encounters with homeworking, we've seen, you know, policemen, teachers, maybe taking on agent roles because they can work from home. So there's an appeal to it that maybe gets us a slightly different agent set as well. So I think contact centers generally, because the technology is easier now than it would have been 10 years ago, I think they've actually adjusted really well.
Well, that's good. I mean, we're going through a couple of waves here, as you'd be aware, where people had largely come back into the office and then been disrupted and needed to go back home. And I think we're probably going to see that rolling possibly across the whole country. Fingers crossed that it does not happen like that. You know, everything on me is crossed. So yes, John,
somebody I know called it hokey cokey offices the other day. So, you know, you're in, you're out, you're in, you're out. So
oh, okay. that's a bit of a drunken party song, speaking of winos. So John would like to know whether you think automation for managers in terms of agent issues in communications, call durations, acoustic issues might be useful in a COVID normal home working scenario.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think any of the issue, well, acoustics aside, I'm on a Jabra call. They know way more about acoustics than I do. But I mean, a lot of the noise cancelling stuff, yeah, that's absolutely is relevant. So instead of cancelling out the general buzz of the contact centre, you're probably cancelling out the noise of dogs barking and kids. And actually, yeah, I was talking to somebody the other day that was using their shed in their garden as an office, and it rains a lot here in the UK, you might have heard. And you know, the noise of the rain on the shed can be problematic. So things like noise cancelling headsets always comes out as one of the the really high priorities. Obviously, you know, things like ergonomics, that doesn't go away either. So, you know, how do you help people in terms of their home office setup? I think we've been home working in BT for a very long time. I did some interviews right at the beginning of the pandemic, not just with contact center people, but said, what's your number one recommendation? And the number of people that said, get a good chair, was phenomenal. And it's quite funny. One of the contact centers I was talking to had said that what they'd done when they closed the contact center was basically put a whole ton of chairs in a van and basically delivered them to their agents' houses so that they had the right ergonomic chairs to sit in, because that makes a huge amount of difference. So I think absolutely we do need to think about, you know, creating a great home office setup for agents, because that helps them to work well. So yeah.
Thank you. David, it would be remiss of me not to bring you in on this part of the conversation, because I know you've been working with contact centres that are now at home, but also typical office workers. Do you want to share a little bit about the importance of acoustics and what you're seeing?
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Fiona. One of the areas that we've seen as people move from this kind of centralized contact center to the decentralized work from home is with a particular product we have called the Engage. The microphone acts as a sensor. So while you're talking, it also picks up the background noise within the environment. It was originally obviously designed to kind of measure the noise within a contact center. But what we're finding is now that it's being deployed in the home environment, it's now almost sensing, without recording in any way and without infringing on personal liberties, it kind of senses the noise within the work from home environment and can report back centrally to say, is the dog barking? Is the noise too loud? Is the corrugated iron roof in your shed causing a problem with acoustics? And it starts to become the intelligence behind the kind of noise side, and of course, you know, just the fact that it picks up the speech and delivers the noise. So there's an awful lot of things we can start to do intelligently with the acoustic side of the contact center.
Thanks, David. Nicola, another question for you. You just shared a lot of data with us, like a lot of data, which was great because we're contact centre people and we love our data. Are you seeing any significant regional variations across the globe?
Yeah, we do. I think when you split the data down country by country, you tend to get, I call it the East-West split. So what we typically find is that you get very conservative cultures that are typically a lot of the European ones, so the Netherlands, Germany, places like that. Well, actually mostly Germany, Belgium, where digital adoption has been slightly slower, certainly in terms of channel preferences. We do see more leaning towards more traditional channels in those countries. Then you've got a kind of block of countries in the middle. So Australia would be one of them, the US, the UK, where adoption has been, you know, much higher. And then you get the crazy countries like India and China, where you've got really massive adoption, but a skew towards smartphones. So I mean, in those countries, that's the default, you know, window on the world, effectively. So everything's going through the smartphone. So I mean, China's a weird market anyway, and I keep saying that the China data and the India data is slightly skewed because we tend to focus on urban. So, you know, we're not looking at rural, but, you know, you're seeing, you know, adoption of things like WeChat. I mean, you can do so much on WeChat that probably we wouldn't do on something like WhatsApp in that sort of middle block of countries that we're using it, but we're not using it to buy, to book, to do all the crazy things that we're seeing in China. And India, again, it's a slightly different adoption of the technology. It's very smartphone centric, it's very app driven. And sometimes those phones are not necessarily the latest phones either. So we're also seeing a growth in things like proactive SMS and SMS messaging. So yeah, there are regional variations. I find that fascinating. I could do probably a full 2 hours on what we've just found in the data in terms of how we've unpicked it. But that's largely it. There's kind of the more conservative countries, the sort of ones in the middle that are starting to adopt more, and then the craziness that's going on often in some of the Asian countries.
Thank you. You outlined quite a number of issues with chat. What are the lessons, or what can we learn to do better?
Yeah, as I said, that I think we've got to recognize, so chat, particularly the synchronous chat stuff, was being driven largely by an economic model. You know, how many concurrent sessions can I get agents doing? And if I get enough volume, you know, that then reduces my cost per session. That was the theory. I did actually go into one contact center, actually that was in Asia as well, which they had 10 concurrent sessions into an agent. And I was kind of, that can't be working. We don't normally recommend more than 3, but even 3 can be difficult because often some of the queries are quite difficult. So, you know, I'm not sure the cost savings are necessarily as evident as the business case might seem. And then you've got to look at the detrimental effects of having that stuttering conversation being cut off, or indeed, you know, as I said, the demand where customers just get really fed up and say, can I ring you? So how do you then integrate? Because you don't want the agent to go, well, sorry, I can't take a phone call, but I'll give you a number and you have to start again with another agent. That's not a great experience. So again, to be honest, that's nothing to do with the technology and the platform. I think some of the frustrations we've had in the past is when we're deploying contact center platforms, they usually, most of the big ones are all singing or dancing. They will do every channel you throw at it. And then people just turn on chat, email and the phone, and they silo things. So there's the phone team over there, there's the chat team over there, there's the social media team over there. They don't talk to each other. They don't have the capability to kind of jump on each other's. So it's a silo thing more than so it's an organizational problem rather than necessarily a problem with the technology. And I am seeing that change. We're seeing a lot of agents here jumping on different channels, but again, you still get the problem with asynchronous and synchronous because you can't mix them. So you can't be on a phone call and simultaneously be doing a chat session at the same time. The brain does not work that way. So you have to look at asynchronous versus synchronous agents. So have your synchronous agents on phone calls and chat, have your asynchronous agents on all of the multiplicity of other asynchronous channels. That could be the way to go. But yeah, I think we can learn a lot around that sort of, you know, early deployment of chat more from an economic model perspective than maybe customer experience. But I don't ignore chat. I think it's a channel that's got a lot of growth in it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I must admit, when I'm judging in some of our local regions, the eyebrows are raised, certainly about the number of concurrent chats that are expected. And not only does that have a potential deleterious experience for the customer, but I often wonder about what it's doing to that staff member, trying to manage that and the cognitive load that they're having to deal with at that point in time. I mean, yikes. Yeah. We have a question, which is a little bit of an explanation and then the question. So lots of organisations are moving to MS Teams for their enterprise collaboration. What trends are happening in the market to address multi-platform environments, for example, toggling back and forth between different systems such as Teams and the contact center system, for instance?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Andrew Small, who's our product line guy, loves talking about this because I think we realized probably about 5-6 years ago that the world of unified comms, so the Teams world, was starting to come together with the contact center world. We even, you know, and it's starting to happen now that actually some of the unified comms platforms are becoming contact center platforms, because actually, if you think about it, what we're trying to do is collaborate with customers. The only thing that's largely missing is the MIS. So we're starting to see the unified comms market and the contact center market start to come together. Now, at the moment, they are separate. In that particular case, absolutely, you're ending up having to toggle between systems, which again, given that you're probably toggling between more than 2, there's normally, I mean, I've seen again about 15 different systems on an agent desktop. That's horrible. And to your point around cognitive load, not good either. So having to remember how to use different systems, some of which you might use every day, some of which you don't, increases the agent's cognitive load exponentially. And they should be paying attention to customers, not necessarily to what system am I using and how do I use that system. So I think increasingly we're going to see mergers, acquisitions in the UC world and contact center world that actually bring that functionality together. So whether it's collaborating out to customers, or inevitably because agents are picking up more complex stuff, and frankly, supply chains and the ways that we collaborate within organizations has become more complex as well. So also, back into the organization in terms of collaboration and how do I solve this problem for the customer, that logically starts to fit more the contact center model. So I think, at the moment it's toggling. I suspect that at some point we're going to see a lot of commonality and mergers and agent desktops that actually incorporate the UC functionality of things like Teams in it.
Well, I can't believe it, Nicola. That is the fastest hour I've probably sat through.
Wow.
Thank you so much for being so engaging, so knowledgeable, and just a delight to listen to, and sharing so much of yourself about your preferences. We will have to get you into Australian wine the next time you come out.
I would love
here.
to come again.
I promise you, I'll take you for a drink by the Sydney Opera House somewhere, and I'm sure David would be there because I know he likes a little drinky poos. Thank you very much to everybody that has joined us today, and to David and the team at Jabra, our national silver sponsors, for enabling us to have your company today, Nicola. I can't thank you enough. And to everyone, it's 5 o'clock in Sydney. It's, some people would call it drink o'clock. So with that, I wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day. Nicola, wonderful whole of your day ahead of you. Thank you everyone for being part of it, and we will see you next time.